Welcome everyone to this session of IBNU. My name is Gina Cook. I'm happy to be with you here today. I'm a big internationalist. I also am on the faculty at the business school. I teach international business courses at MSU Denver here in Colorado. So happy that we have such a diverse audience today. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our session is focused on sustainability, and we have here with us one of the local gurus. Claire Leiner is Director of Sustainability and External Relations at Newmont Mining Corporation. She focuses on human rights, responsible sourcing, and other sustainability issues. She has a long history in the sustainable area and comes to us from the UK. Here today, she's going to speak on Newmont's activities in the area and what that looks like in actual practice. So let me scroll up your slides and then welcome Claire.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina. And thank you everyone for the invitation. I had no idea this was going to be such a diverse audience and was thrilled to see how many states and countries folks are from. I saw someone just there who speaks Twi, and that's obviously one of the regional dialects in Ghana where Newmont has two operations. So that was fantastic to see. And I caught a little bit of Sam's presentation as well and can confirm, having spent 6 months in India, that it is an incredible country. So that was pretty cool to hear about that. But really appreciate the invitation to be here. As Gina said, I'm a Director for External Relations at Newmont Mining. I lead our human rights program and our program on what we call responsible sourcing. But I will talk a little bit more about our activities and our strategies in the sustainability space shortly. Next slide, please, Gina. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about Newmont and our strategy, what we're now terming our environmental, social, and governance strategy. And I'll talk about that sort of high-level overview piece and then give you some case studies of things on the ground so you get a bit more of a taste of how we operationalize some of our strategy. And I'll look at our environmental and social performances as well. Again, putting some case studies in there that hopefully you find interesting. Next slide, please, Gina. So just a little bit of a background on Newmont for those of you that don't know us. We are the world's largest gold mining company. We're based here in Colorado, so very thrilled to be speaking to this audience. We, as I said, largest gold mining company. We produce copper, silver, zinc, and lead as well. And we have operations in North America, South America, Australia, and Africa, as you can see on this slide. And I mentioned those two African operations are in Ghana. Next slide, please. So before I go into some of the detail of our strategies, policies, and work over the years, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the terminology you may have heard in the business and society space. And I think the terms have evolved over the years quite significantly. So a decade or so ago, we might have talked about corporate social responsibility. We might have talked in terms of non-financial risk. And that sort of evolved into discussions around sustainability and businesses' role in being sustainable and contributing to a sustainable world. And then recently I mentioned the current term that resonates widely with folks is ESG. And I'm sure many of you are aware of ESG. So environmental, social, governance, performance is what we mean by the term ESG. And as I mentioned, this now resonates widely with investors, with companies, with civil society, and it is applied cross-sectorally. So when we spoke about sustainability in the past, it was often associated with certain sectors, whereas ESG is a very cross-functional and cross-sectoral term that's used. So as a company that's 100 years old, we have learned some very, very hard lessons over the years. And that's shaped us as a company, and it's shaped the way that we think about ESG issues now. So whatever term we're using, we clearly articulate our commitment to being a responsible member of society, a responsible global citizen, through our purpose, which you can see here is to create value and improve lives through sustainable and responsible mining. Next slide, please, Gina. So I'm not going to go into this slide in too much detail, but I just wanted to illustrate how ESG is really integrated into our global strategy. So you can see here that our ESG pillar sits alongside a pillar on operational growth and on operational excellence and on growth. So objectives like meeting climate targets, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those shortly, like improving site level performance and ensuring that host communities recover and thrive post-COVID. Those kind of objectives sit alongside targets on production and expansion, which obviously are an important piece from a financial perspective, but the ESG components are given equal weight in the strategy. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight our values that you can see here around safety, integrity, sustainability, inclusion, and responsibility. When I started in the industry, probably almost 15 years ago now, I never ever would have associated these kind of values with a mining company. I now know the significant potential, and I do say potential because there is still a lot more that the industry needs to do to improve its practices. But I now understand that potential for an industry that might be in a country for several generations to have a positive contribution to that society. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put this timeline up here to highlight that even though the framing of ESG might be new, the issues are not new for Newmont, and we've been working on them for many, many years. I'm not going to walk through all the pieces on this timeline, but just to highlight a few. Going back as early as 2001, we were a founding member of the International Council on Mining and Metals. And the ICMM is an organization committed to a safe, fair, and sustainable mining industry. So we were one of 7 companies at the time at the inception of the ICMM, which has now grown to 28 companies. And those 28 companies represent almost a third of the global mining and metals industry. So it's a very significant voice in the industry, and it was pretty cool that we were around there at its origins. We published our first sustainability report in 2004, appointed our first chief sustainability officer in 2007. And then you can see throughout the years the various standards that we have committed to and the various reporting frameworks, such as one of the seminal reporting frameworks on human rights that we adopted. We were the first extractives company to start reporting using that framework. Next slide, please. I won't dwell on this, just wanted to illustrate that sustained commitment to ESG issues, to sustainability issues and strong performance in this area has paid off in terms of the external recognition that we've received across a number of areas and organizations. Next slide. So just a little bit on the business case and why it's important that we care about our environmental and our social performance. I think the first piece is from the perspective of our employees and future employees. Maybe some of you on the line will be our future employees. We know that companies have always been scrutinized on their impacts and how they do no harm or manage their negative impacts. But this is not enough anymore. And we know, particularly from some of the younger generations entering the workforce, they really want to know that they are working for a values-driven organization. And they're often quite skeptical of businesses' motives. So we really need to be able to demonstrate that we are responsible citizens in order to continue to attract top talent. Otherwise, we won't survive as a business. And then our host communities, they expect the same thing. Mining can have a huge impact on their lives, both positively and negatively. And unless we are contributing to their social and economic development, we're not going to gain and maintain social acceptance, which again is a really critical component of our ability to continue to operate. And then finally, from the investor side of things, we now know that investors expect a level of transparency around our ESG performance than they have in the past. So this is, there's always been investor scrutiny, but this is really, really intensified in recent years. And they seem to understand the link between ESG performance and a well-run and profitable company. So they're often using their financial influence now to promote responsible practices. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about governance as the underpinning for strong environmental and social governance. Next slide, please, Gina. So as I mentioned, good governance really has to underpin strong and robust social and environmental performance. And without it, the other two pieces would not exist. So in this regard, Newmont has had an independent board for 15 years. We have a robust audit committee as part of that board, a safety and sustainability committee, and a leadership development and compensation committee. And it's the Safety and Sustainability Committee of the board that really reviews our progress against our sustainability targets. It's instrumental in defining what future targets should look like. And they really do challenge us to be more progressive when thinking about future targets. So very active committee of the board there, which is great. It is the Leadership and Development Committee that holds management to account for succession plans. That committee takes into account ESG performance as part of the promotion process for our leaders. So that's pretty critical as well. And then I just wanted to highlight our commitment to diversity and inclusion. And these are both incredibly critical values for Newmont. And setting the tone for that commitment really starts at the top and at the board level. We know that diversity of thought and background drives better decision-making and better outcomes. So 70% of our current board members are either gender, ethnically, or racially diverse. We have members from Mexico, from Ghana. We have a member who was a former Grand Chief of the Cree Council. So again, very important piece for us and very important that we integrate that commitment throughout all levels of the organization. The final piece I wanted to highlight on the governance side is our commitment to transparency. And we know that transparency is really a prerequisite for building credibility and trust. I've put a couple of the standards and reporting frameworks that we adhere to on this slide. We have been recognized as one of the top 5 most transparent companies in the S&P 500 as recognized by Bloomberg. And we really know that as a company with significant impacts, again, both positive and negative, transparent reporting can really help with an understanding of our key risks and opportunities. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to touch on our environmental performance. Next slide, please. And wanted to highlight our sustainability framework, which is really those institutional pieces that underpin our performance. So these range from our global policies to the standards that we implement at all of our sites, to the targets that we set for ourselves and hold ourselves publicly accountable for, to how we report performance. So on the environmental side, I've included our environmental standards here. Again, all of these standards have requirements that every single site has to implement. And these might be standards like engaging with key stakeholders on biodiversity planning, for example, or having in place stakeholder engagement plans for mine closure. So really important pieces that everyone globally adheres to. I've also highlighted some of our 2021 targets here. We have targets around water, around climate change, which I'm going to talk about next, and around reclamation. Next slide, please. So last year, as you can see here, we announced climate targets of a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, with the ultimate goal of having net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We had a previous goal that concluded last year of a 16.5% reduction. I think one of the key things that differentiates Newmont in this space is that we have really based these targets, they're science-based. So we worked with an organization called the Science Based Target Initiative, which is an organization that mobilizes the private sector to take urgent action on climate. And the SBTI really assesses and validates your climate targets. And they actually pushed us to go further initially. But they have now validated our targets. They've recognized us publicly on their website as a committed company. And they've helped us define specific emission reduction pathways to meet the Paris Agreement objective of being well below the 2 degrees Celsius temperature change. So in addition to those science-based targets, we've also committed to directing $500 million to climate initiatives over the next 5 years. And that's going to help us meet these targets through the use of a variety of technologies. In June, we published our first climate report based on the requirements of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Some of you might be aware of TCFD. It's an investor-led framework which aims to improve the quality of climate-related financial disclosures. And then future reports are going to track our progress towards our goals and track our progress against our strategy. Next slide, please. Just thinking about how we're going to achieve these ambitious commitments, we have embedded climate considerations into our investment decision-making process. For example, by thinking about fuel switching, so where we would replace diesel with natural gas and biofuels, electrification, converting to electrical processing and vehicle technology. And we've recently done this one of our Australian mines. Renewable energy, so investing in renewable energy solutions, and then carbon capture and storage. And you can see on this slide some of the other components that we're thinking of and we're working through, including solar and wind projects. Next slide, please. So finally, on the environmental side, before I get into some of the social performance pieces, I wanted to provide an in-country example of really what it looks like to operationalize our standards and what it means to be a responsible citizen on the ground in country where we operate. And the example I've put up here is from Mexico. It's our Peñasquito mine, where prior to 2020, we really had a history of disputes with one of the communities surrounding our mine. So the Cedros community is one of 25 neighboring communities. And many of those disputes related to water, or were at least couched in terms of concerns around water. So in December last year, we signed a historic water pact with the community, agreeing to secure a sustainable water supply for them. The community then ratified a formal agreement, and you can see that ratification process here on the slide. And that agreement involves land use, water availability, infrastructure, and social investment. And the pact and the agreement allow for a number of water treatment plants being put in place, new wells, water trucking, and then 90 other infrastructure projects and community development projects. So this was a pretty important and seminal agreement for us to make with the Cedros community. I won't go through all the critical factors here, but some of them include government's role in the process, it really bringing all the parties to the table, and then government taking ownership of some of the processes, the water management processes going forward. We've also committed to participatory monitoring with Cedros. So we'll be building trust and transparency through that process while also creating awareness around water usage and management capabilities. Next slide, please. So moving on to our social performance piece. Next slide, please. Our sustainability framework that I mentioned earlier, again, our social performance piece is a key part of that. We have a number of social standards that you can see here, and then a number of targets that we've set around local and Indigenous employment, around community commitments, and then around managing human rights risks in our supplier base. Next slide, please. So I just briefly wanted to highlight this notion of social acceptance, because I think it speaks to the heart of being a responsible citizen and actor in society. And social acceptance is often how we characterize community support for our activities. So is essential for us to be able to continue to operate, is to have and maintain social acceptance. And you can see on this slide the key components of that, what needs to happen across the mine life cycle. So from opening a mine to closing it, we need to be managing our impacts. We need to be engaging with stakeholders, and we need to be creating value. So if communities are thriving post-closure, we know that we have done our part to catalyze sustainable local economic development. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to provide a case study. Next slide, please. Again, it's a bit more real if we put some of these strategies and standards into context in terms of what it looks like in some of the countries where we operate. So I wanted to talk about our engagement with 2 First Nation communities in Canada throughout the COVID pandemic. Obviously, that's still ongoing. But I thought it's an interesting example of how we really adhere to the requirements in our standards through building relationships. So this slide just provides a little bit of the context around COVID. It shows our mines and emphasizes that early on, our CEO was very, very clear that we would not continue to operate if doing so posed risks to our workforce or to the communities in and around our mines. As a result of COVID risks, we put 6 of our 12 mines into care and maintenance at some stage. And care and maintenance is really where you stop production, you stop revenue generating activities, you probably have a skeleton crew on site, you might be doing basic environmental monitoring, but beyond that, you're really not operating and definitely not generating revenue. And so, as I said, in Canada, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and this year, Australia had to go into care and maintenance at some stage. And we estimate that this cost us about $178 million. And I put that figure on this slide because I wanted to illustrate that first and foremost, we were concerned with health and safety. And that had a financial cost, but that was really a secondary consideration. And again, I think that's one of the key pieces of a responsible business. They are willing to do the right thing sometimes over profit and over concerns with profit. Next slide, please. So I was just going to give the example of two of our mines, Musselwhite and Eleanor, both in Canada. Musselwhite is a fly-in, fly-out operation located north of Thunder Bay in Canada. Eleanor is in a very remote corner of northern Quebec. And we have many First Nation groups that work in and around the mine there. And as with many First Nation groups in Canada, and actually Indigenous groups globally, the communities, some of the communities have had a very, very negative history with diseases and pandemics. Many First Nation communities in Canada lost over 50% of their population in 1918 around the Spanish flu, and lost many more to other diseases like smallpox and things over the years. So because of this, many of our First Nation employees were incredibly nervous about community transmission of COVID. So as a result of those concerns that they expressed to us, we actually voluntarily put Eleanor into care and maintenance. And at one stage, the government actually shut down mining in the province, but we had put that mine into care and maintenance because of those community concerns. The government of Ontario continued to classify mining as an essential service, but again, due to those community concerns, we voluntarily put Musselwhite into care and maintenance as well. Eleanor was in care and maintenance for 60 days and Musselwhite for 90, which again is not an insignificant amount of time as a business to not be generating revenue from two sites. Throughout that time, we continued to engage with the First Nation leadership very, very closely, and we were able to restart both mines with approval from those communities, and we ramped up based on the pace and scale that those communities were comfortable with. Another key piece here was this communication at the highest level. It was our general managers, and in the employee hierarchy at site, the general managers are really as high up as you can go. So they were engaging directly with First Nation leadership, and that piece was key. And then our CEO was also engaging with the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation at Eleanor. So a key component there for respectful stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please.
Claire, just a 5-minute warning.
Okay, thanks, Gina. Next slide, please. So another key piece, which I will now highlight pretty rapidly, that I wanted to mention in relation to being a responsible global citizen is our work on human rights. And so I've included a timeline here. I won't go through it in detail. Just wanted to highlight that as early as the 90s, we were signing agreements with our First Nation communities in Canada, with our Aboriginal communities in and around our mines in Australia. We produced our first human rights standard in 2014. I don't know if any of you are aware of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but we have aligned our standards and our strategy to that key seminal human rights framework. And you can see some of the activities throughout this timeline here. I'm going to skip through those to the next slide, please, Gina. Maybe just to highlight where you can get some more information about our human rights approach. We have various documents on our website, and I've included the link there, so you'll be able to see that when you look back on this presentation. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to touch on our work on Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm sure most of you are aware that the SDGs were adopted in 2015 by the UN. They call for urgent action by governments and companies to end poverty, to improve health and education, to reduce inequality, and to spur economic growth. Sorry, next slide, please, Gina. For Newmont, ensuring that we positively contribute to the SDGs has meant that we have prioritized those goals where we think we can have the most impact and those goals that are most aligned to our business strategy. And that business strategy alignment was really, really important to ensure that our contributions were not just short-term philanthropic endeavors, but they were really linked into our business strategy, and so our contribution will be much more meaningful to them. I pulled out the 5 goals that we've prioritized here, and we have numerous examples of how we contribute to those through reducing infant mortality rates in Ghana, to implementing water programs in Peru, where 10,000 households now have regular access to water, many of them for the first time through some of our programs there. I mentioned some of our global inclusion and diversity work. And we obviously contribute to decent work and economic growth through direct job creation and also through induced employment in the wider community. Next slide, please, Gina. So finally, just to end with some of the examples that I talked about today, and many, many more are outlined in our reports on our website. So we have an annual sustainability report. I mentioned we produced our first climate report. So really urge you to look at those pieces and the other reports that we include for more information. And I'm right up against time, so I will pause there, but really, really look forward to questions. Thanks, Gina.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. That was really interesting. Appreciate your time. And we do have a bunch of questions. So let's see here. The first one is, do you think it's possible for the United States to go carbon neutral by 2060? Or do you think that's too ambitious? And where would you recommend we start, if so?
Yeah, good question. And was that by 2050, which is the Paris, the commitment in the Paris Agreement? I assume that was the date referenced. Yes, I do not only think it's possible, but that it's absolutely fundamental and necessary. I think that there are a whole mix of things that need to happen for that to happen. You obviously need the corporate sector involved and making very strong commitments to climate, science-based commitments to climate, because those are the most meaningful. I read an article in The Economist last week, I think, saying that 4,500 of the top companies had made some kind of commitment to emission reduction targets, but of those, only about a fifth were science-based. So unless they're science-based, it's definitely not as meaningful. So you need action by the corporate sector. You obviously need a regulatory framework in place that's going to drive that action. And we've seen some work on that by the current administration. So business and government have to work hand in hand. And then all of us as individuals, as citizens, actually I'm not a US citizen, but as a global citizen, we all need to be thinking about the part that we can play. You know, what we individually can do to positively contribute to the environment, to reduce our individual footprints. And where governments aren't taking actions, or individual states are not taking actions, to use our voice in encouraging action. So I do think it's possible. It's going to be very challenging.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Our next question is, in the mining space, how does Newmont compete with other companies? And does implementing innovative yet expensive sustainability policies increase your competitiveness or hinder financial strength?
Great question. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, I think you know, we constantly bench ourselves against our peers. And there are some areas where we're clearly leading. There are some areas where I think we still have more work to do. We don't see financial performance as separate from ESG performance. The two are intrinsically linked, and we are able to have robust, financial performance because it's underpinned by good governance and by strong environmental and social performance. And honestly, there is not a conversation that we have with any investor at the moment that does not ask a question on some element of our ESG work. So this is top of mind for investors now. And the area where we're really trying to differentiate ourselves is in the transparency space, where we're trying to be very honest about our risks and opportunities. And I think that transparency, as I said, helps build trust and credibility. And in that area, we are getting external recognition for being leaders. We're recognized in certain subject benchmarks as well. So, for example, in the corporate human rights benchmark, we're not top of the extractives companies, but I think we were 19 out of 200 companies across several sectors in 2020, and we have more work to do there. But, we're trying to be as transparent as possible where that transparency drives performance improvements on the ground. So you have to be careful about, becoming a PR machine or over-communicating your messages. You want those commitments to reporting to really be driving performance improvements on the ground.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have another question about, do you think governments need to better incentivize businesses to prioritize sustainability? And if so, what would you recommend in that regard?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, a lot of governments are already incentivizing responsible practices across the board of the sustainability agenda or ESG agenda. And you see that here in the US for various pieces of legislation like the Dodd-Frank, for example, Dodd-Frank Act, which looks at minerals coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It looks at your transparency around due diligence processes. There is a Transparency in Supply Chain Act in California, again, asking for increased disclosure around how you're managing human rights risks in your value chain. And then we see a lot coming out of the EU. So there's discussions on EU mandatory due diligence, and that's going to apply to the human rights as well as environment. So you really see governments moving in the mandatory direction. I think for us, one of the positive things about adopting this UN guiding principles framework that I mentioned is that has become, even though it's a voluntary framework, it's moving much more from soft law into hard law. So you see these governments really committing to the UN guiding principles. That EU piece that I mentioned is looking to incorporate the UNGPs as a mandatory piece of legislation. And so, you as a company, you want to try and be ahead of that and have the processes in place that ensure you're ready for any legislation when it comes. But smart legislation is helpful for companies. It can provide policy coherence. It can provide, guidance on how expectations should be implemented. So I think it's not always a bad thing, provided it's not anti-competitive and there is coherence across regions.
Great, thank you. Oh gosh, we have so many interesting questions. I think we've only got time for maybe one or two more. There are several about basically, are there internship opportunities with Newmont, and or how did you get into this particular sector, and what would you recommend for students that are interested in pursuing an opportunity in sustainability or within the mining framework?
Yeah, so there definitely are internship opportunities, and we have a pretty good intern program. So I should have actually put my email on the presentation, but you'll probably be able to find me on LinkedIn, and if anyone wants to send me their resume, I'll make sure that it gets into the right hands. I think we sort of open up opportunities in around springtime. So absolutely, that's a great way to get an understanding of the sector. I got into mining a little bit by accident, and I won't bore everyone with my career history, but I was working at the UN in New York after I graduated in humanitarian aid. So the focus was on getting funds out of the door very quickly for underfunded emergencies or for rapid response emergencies. And I sort of missed the development component, and I knew I wanted to shift into development work where you could see sort of more longer term thinking or more thoughts about longer term development outcomes. So I moved back to London, and I was actually just doing some temporary work. And I was placed with the International Council on Mining and Metals, which is one of the organizations I referenced earlier, as being pretty instrumental in the social and environmental performance space for the industry. Anyway, I ended up there, and I said, don't be ridiculous. I will never work for the mining industry. It's terrible. But then I really started to look at the potential for positive impact that the industry can have over many, many generations. And I was sold on that. But I think internships are a great way to get some experience of things. If you're young enough and willing to travel, I think that's another great option, is to look at where companies have operations globally and where they might need on-site capacity or support, and reach out or look at jobs in particular countries as well, to get some of that experience. I had a little bit of that, but I wish I'd had more before coming to a corporate role.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. I think it's time for us to wrap up our session. I appreciate the audience's questions, and everyone, please join me in thanking Claire Leiner for a wonderful presentation and a lot of really interesting info about sustainability. Thank you so much.